thank all of you for joining us for the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari. Slowly making our way through Chapter 3, we're now on to Section 7, the Barbarian or Imperial representation. This is going to be a fun read. We're already expecting that we're only going to get just about halfway. We're hoping maybe a little bit beyond halfway. But with any luck, we'll have a handful of people who are here who are up for taking on a little bit more of the reading, so that way I can take occasional breaks, and hopefully some other people who have a better understanding of some of the stuff they reference here. Starting off the chat with a little bit of house... Oh, sorry, go ahead and Kip. Roger? Kent? Who was that? Well, someone. A little bit of housekeeping. We are trying to figure out what we're going to be doing with the server. We're moving some talks around. We're trying to figure out how we can get a little bit more activity, 1,600 people, and a limited chat. So we're going to try to figure out what we can do to sort of boost that. If you have any ideas, don't hesitate to hit us up in the suggestions area. If you want to volunteer, become a mod, run a chat, you want to talk through a book or have a conversation, you're always welcome inside of us, and drop a note in the volunteer chat. We have a bunch of talks again this week. Kent, do you want to run through what's going on the Continental Philosophy server and with your other talks?
Yeah, we have on Friday, we're going to have a discussion of the origin of the work of art by Heidegger, and so that should be interesting. And then we're going to start on September 2nd, Zizek, Sex and the Failed Absolute. So that should be an interesting read.
Probably my favorite Zizek text recently. Maybe one of his best. So it's I'm probably going to be... I'm excited. And Alibaba comes today. How about literature? Anything this week?
Alibaba does indeed come today, and on Saturday is coming, unless things change, and appropriately, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. So join us for a reading of Oedipus Rex on Saturday at noon PDT, and likewise on Sunday, Simondang. They will continue with their session at 11 a.m. PDT.
All right, and please join all of those chats if you'd like to, and if you have more you'd want to join. The last thing is, right now, this may be our last of these that we're doing on a noon on a Monday. This week we're going to be setting up our new time frame. We're probably moving, shockingly, a whole hour earlier, maybe two. We're trying to debate between those, and we'll be passing out a poll this week. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive into our text today, Barbarian or Imperial representation. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, I have the text up so you can read along with us, and also on the left side of the screen is the chat, so you'll get to see all the wonderful things that are said only in text. Be ready for way too much fucking meme. As always, anyone feel free to jump in as we get into the conversation. The more of you, the better. So we start with immediately right to incest with the sister. We really need to do that schizoanalysis of Pornhub, by the way, because all of this just feels like there's something going. Incest with the sister and incest with the mother are very different things. The sister is not a substitute for the mother. The one belongs to the connective category of alliance, the other to the disjunctive category of filiation. Incest with the sister is prohibited insofar as the conditions of territorial coding require that alliance not be confounded with filiation, and incest with the mother, insofar as descent within filiation, must not be allowed to interfere with ascending lines. That is why the despot's incest is twofold, by virtue of the new alliance and direct filiation. He begins by marrying the sister, but he enters into this forbidden endogamous marriage outside the tribe, inasmuch as he is himself outside his tribe, on the outside or at the outer limits of the territory. This is what Pierre Gordon showed in his strange book. The same rule that proscribes incest must prescribe it for certain persons. Exogamy must result in the position of men outside the tribe, who for their part are entitled to an endogamous marriage and are able, by virtue of this formidable right, to serve as initiators to exogamous subjects of both sexes, the Sacred Deflower or the ritual initiator, on the mountain or across the waters. The wilderness, land of betrothal. All the flows converge on a man such as this. All the alliances find themselves countersected by this new alliance that overcodes them. Endogamous marriage outside the tribe places the hero in a position to overcode all the endogamous marriages into the tribe. I'm just going to confirm it is pronounced endogamous. Seems stupid. I looked it up. It says endogamous. Read something else. Terrible word.
In French it's endogène, which would be endogenous.
Yeah, but everything sounds better in French.
Yeah, sorry.
It's such an awkward anglicized word. So this opens in such a very fun way, where we immediately dive right into what I actually found to be one of the more difficult parts of this entire chapter. And of course, everything's trying to relate back to Oedipus, but it's how incest directly relates to the position of the despot. Where, of course, we saw in Savage Times, the prohibition against incest was not some psychological thing, but instead was done in order to maintain the ability for a sister to be married off to another family, so that way you could maintain alliances, and for you not to fuck your mom, so that way your past, your filiation, your descent backwards could continue to have the mythology trace, so you could find your place within things. That was my understanding of incest at that point. Please, Alyosha, what are you saying? Establish how this isn't ahistorical. Please go into that for a moment.
Well, I mean, I don't know if I'm qualified. That's really. I find myself. I know we got
dude. No one here is qualified. like it's
talk about the repressed representative and displaced representative and all that. I mean, I have a vague sort of recollection of that. But at this beginning portion, this almost reminds me of Derrida's thing about the example, where like an example is never just an example, so that they throw out these examples. But I'm like, I just want to, I'm okay. We just read Nietzsche in the literature group, and there's all kinds of historical mistakes in that. And you can still get something out of it. So I'm not trying to drag it down. I'm just trying to understand, are they basing this all on like these handful of examples? Of
so let's take a vote. Let's take a vote. We still have Polbot working inside of the chat, right, Jack? Poll is
simple
this
Polbot
allegory? Thumbs up if it's allegory, thumbs down if you think this is real, or stupid, like I don't know. I mean, come on, click it. It's in the chat. So,
I mean, they bring up that specific tribe as their example. That's why I just want to understand it. Are they just extrapolating from that one situation, or what are they trying to say?
So I don't read it as I read it as both. I read it as that they are actually being allegorical, like in general, because they're trying to relate things back to Oedipus, and they're trying to have this conversation of how our relations to our family are not necessarily something that is birthed in us from the primordial ooze, that we aren't born with Oedipus thousands of years ago, that our relationship to our sisters and mothers change over time, and that this is sort of one of those things that is how we can track coding or overcoding of desire flows. However, they really get into some fucking specific examples inside of this section that make me think that it can't just be allegorical. For example, the concept of the Sacred Deflower, the ritual initiator. I mentioned to Jack earlier all of this prima nocta, the idea that a king gets the wife on her first night of marriage. They were on page 200 of I don't know, my edition. But the idea is that there's kind of both. There is some reality in this. The despots did take women as their own. We know that they married their sisters, like, for a long time. There's some hilarious, awful stories of incest and inbreeding amongst major royal rich families. So it's not some crazy out of nowhere thing. But I mean, it feels like it dances between allegory and reality too much for me to not to just say it's both.
We get into this question every week, and I don't think we've really progressed here, because what we are trying to figure out is how the concept of genealogy works, and we haven't really progressed in that regard.
No, and I think I've had a handful of conversations, and after reading through Holland and a few others, I think we will not sort of have a closure to their genealogy and understanding of it until well into their introduction to schizoanalysis. And I think that's when they start closing in and becoming a lot more clinical in response. But I think they play into a place that is, the term fuzzy logic comes to mind, where is it true? Yeah, sure. Like that feels, is that close? Like, does that make sense? Or am I sounding like a fool?
I mean, it's pretty clear that they don't write a history book here, right? Like, I would guess that they know how a history book looks like, and this is not how a history book looks like.
Well, we can continue. I think what I'm trying to say is that it's not that I think they're writing history, but it's sort of like, there were certain claims that Nietzsche made in The Birth of Tragedy, for example, that are really contingent on a particular understanding of, like, Dionysius is a foreign god that came to Greece. And then, that's just not that's really not the consensus anymore. So I don't mean to drag it down in that sense. I'm just saying, like, they're using these examples. I'm trying to, even in their own framework, I'm trying to understand how they see it, because it seems like they do see there's specific features to the primitive territorial machine that function in this way. And even in their framework, even if it's not historical, I still don't see it. That's my point.
To make a brief remark on that, I think it might help to consider they're looking to anthropology's discussion of these primitive societies for what they do, in contrast to how psychoanalysis takes it for tries to Oedipalize it, like they were talking about. I think it was 3 or 3-4. But at that level too, like, these societies that they're looking at in terms of these tracings of the socius and of territorializings and representations, I think those form the basic lines of this genealogy. And as I've been thinking about, like, what to do with this section and this chapter, I think you could even walk this out to, like, building, perhaps building a group forming, right? In the beginning, it probably kind of looks like this primitive thing, where you talk about, oh yeah, but we were the original 4 who got it off the ground, and then Steve and George joined, and there's kind of affiliation that starts forming there. And then you can also talk about how, like, one of the founders and you work together, and then you can start to see the economic and politicality of the alliance come into being, until somebody like a central figure comes in as a kind of, like, despotic figure, which is what they're kind of getting into now. So basically, like, I don't think it's meant to be like a traditional history like Lou's saying, but I think the genealogy and what it's tracing points to, like, what these societies are doing and how it effectively leads them into tracing these representations, to tracing things like the incest prohibition and perhaps even power.
I think all these things are connected, power and the incest prohibition. But something you touched upon was how it's not a form of history, and that's right about genealogy. And I remember people here were already saying how difficult that word can be. It's kind of a weighty concept. But without even getting into Nietzsche, we can think of genealogy as, like, certain ideal types for understanding history. D&G describe themselves as doing universal history sometimes in the next schizoanalysis chapter. So these different logical types of social forms are a little bit more like abstract machines. It's not an actual example, that this tribe did this, and so that's a despotic machine. It's just that, well, tribes acting in this way more or less embody this this abstract machine of being a despotic figure, which is this one central phallus that overcodes all the new alliances and shit like this. Does that kind of make sense? Click for anybody?
Yeah, definitely. I read it in this way as well, more like an analogy or some kind of virtual history they create here in parallel to psychoanalysis and ethnology. And for me, it's like we are now at the point where we are talking about the barbarian or the imperial representation and how territorial representations go over to become barbarian, and barbarians are the outsiders. And now here they are talking about these outsiders. They come from over the sea, from the mountain, these initiators that kind of stand outside of the regime of the socius and now have certain new rights and now have the ability to overcode these preceding codes. And by that, maybe these are the predecessors of the despots.
Yeah, actually, Jared's last line there, he typed in chat, I just want to say, universal history is basically a joke, a delusive quadri.
Yeah.
It's a really fair way to put it, and that helps a lot. It's a very simplified way of putting it. It's very true.
Because they're funny, they put these little jokes in there that you'll miss them,
Yeah, because I don't get them, but I do after a while, sort of. I pretend.
I think the point is that they consider this a general economy, and so basically they're looking for these anomalies in order to show that this is a general economy. And we know that, like in Egypt, the marriage of the sister was a very important part of the, the way the power was structured in Egypt. Because from what I've read, you had to be married to a woman from the family in order to have the power. And so in order to keep the power within the family, they would, it was preferable for the marriage to the sister to occur. And so something that was, anomalous, was capitalized on by the ruling power. So I mean, that's all. Those kinds of things are, kind of indications that this is a general economy.
And I think it's worth pointing out also, Holland makes the comment, just because we keep talking about whether or not this is literal or allegorical or just a joke or a story. He talks actually at length about how the idea is that ultimately they're trying to get across is that the despot is in principle everyone's father, but also everyone's son, brother, and spouse. So there's a ubiquity and a natural everything of the phallus that is the despot. So that's kind of what they're pointing at here, not so much the ultra literal.
So, and then the other thing is that, they're pointing back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, and in the Epic of Gilgamesh, oddly enough, the point of contention is the deflowering of the brides on their wedding night by Gilgamesh, and what happens in the epic is that the women complain to the gods, and so then the gods create Enkidu in the wilderness to come in from, he was someone raised by the animals, and he comes in and he's equally powerful to Gilgamesh, and he tries to put a stop to it. And and he is initiated by one of the prostitutes of the city that are sent out to take him from the animal category into the human category through sexual liaison. So it's and there's a confrontation between Enkidu and Gilgamesh, where Enkidu confronts him over this issue, and they fight, and Enkidu loses, and then they become friends, and then they go off on adventures together. But it's just interesting that in the earliest epic we have, this is the case.
Excellent. I'm going to now start moving on, because this is why we will never get out of this section. Because every chapter is every paragraph is going to be like this. It is clear that incest with the mother has a completely different meaning. This time it is a question of the mother of the tribe, as she exists in the tribe, as the hero finds her in penetrating into the tribe, or finds her again in returning to the tribe after his first marriage. He countersects the extended filiations with a direct affiliation. With a direct affiliation, the initiated or initiating hero becomes king. The second marriage develops the consequences of the first. It draws out the effect of the first. The hero begins by marrying the sister, then he marries the mother. The fact that the two acts can, to varying degrees, be bound together, assimilated, does not rule out existence of two sequences in the phenomenon. The union with the princess sister and the union with the mother queen. Incest goes by twos. The hero is always sitting astride two groups, the one where he leaves to find his sister, the other where he returns to find his mother again. The purpose of this double incest is not to produce a flow, not even a magic flow, but to overcode all existing flows, and to ensure that no intrinsic code, no underlying flow escapes the overcoding of the despotic machine. Hence, it is by virtue of his sterility that he guarantees the general fecundity. The marriage with the sister is on the outside. It is the wilderness ordeal. It expresses the spatial divergence from the primitive machine. It provides the old alliances with an outcome. It founds the new alliance by effecting a generalized appropriation of all alliance debts. The marriage with the mother is the return to the tribe. It expresses the temporal divergence from the primitive machine, the difference between the generations. It constitutes the direct filiation that results from the new alliance by effecting a generalized accumulation of filiative stock. Both marriages are essential to the overcoding as the two ends of a tie for the despotic knot. I think this just to mention this paragraph feels like it's more proof that they're talking more allegorical and jokey.
Yeah, I found myself laughing at this one.
Yeah.
One thing of use, though, that stood out to me was talking about no underlying flow escapes the overcoding of the despotic machine. Hence, it is by virtue of his sterility that he guarantees the general fecundity. I interpreted that to be a couple things, but most importantly, this idea of the despot as the father, or someone who is the quasi-cause of production, because his sterility, or his kingliness, I guess, to be sterile, is guaranteeing the general fecundity. That's just what's required for production itself. I mean, desiring production and economics and all the affiliation and stuff is sort of like owes it to him. So the society is in a power relation to this member of it, to this one sort of exception who, right, is sterile but sort of guarantees the reproduction of the social form on a wider scale. Yeah, and in the chat, isn't the despot's body the socius? Yeah, in this case, definitely, yeah. That's what they're talking about here.
Yeah, I think that's what they're getting at too, Jack. The idea that this is where that becomes the socius, because before the alliances and filiations were made by sort of the interchange and interplay of marriages and lineages. Now all of those things ultimately bend, instead of being sort of scattered across the earth, are bent back into the despot, all of those lines. That's where they talk about here, to the flows, overcoding existing flows, redirecting them, all of that to him. I do want to read Roger's comment in the text, though. Maybe a way to understand this passage is to understand how law produces a state of exception into an ontology. Each culture will configure this differently depending on real-world politics and necessities. It's like murder. Law prohibits it, but at the same time furnishes the precision of the possibility of murder and in which conditions it is allowed by the state. As something outside the system, but also the system. The despot is someone who lives both sort of at the very extreme of it, but also is very much part and parcel of the system.
Yeah,
like
the
that.
despot is someone that breaks these taboos of incest. And I find it interesting that they call the marriage with the sister something from the outside, or that happens on the outside, like it has this spatial connotation, and the marriage with the mother has a temporal connotation. So it's more like this picture of a state that is on a plane or on the same continent with other states, like they are brothers and sisters, but they are not the same with them, but still they live in the same plane, and then break the taboo of breaking into their territory to bind them to them by incest and marriage, and at the same way by marrying their mother, like interrupting the historical flow, they transform these aspects as well. It's hard to formulate in a coherent sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's welcome to another thing we've said, I think, every single chat for the last 4 weeks. But I like all of that. Any other thoughts before I move on to the next paragraph?
Yes, I have one. What interests me about this section is I don't think it's necessarily allegorical, although I might be oversensitive to that word. To me, it seems like they're talking about the code, right? And like that's not just the legal code, like Roger's saying, right? Like that's the political and economic code, and that's the affiliative code, right? It's the way these territorial representations fit together in this, at least in the primitive society. That territorial representation is very like separated, even though they interact in that they have this kind of autonomy, it seems. Whereas like with where we're moving in terms of the despot and what they do in terms of sort of exploiting this, it's almost like a clause, legally speaking, but exploiting this sort of rights of incest to establish themselves through paranoiac knowledge, right, into this position. It seems to me that in that way we're talking about someone who understands the socius in a sense, or at least understands the codes at such a level that they're able to be this kind of, because the use of the word hero here is, I think, incredibly interesting, right? In this sense, it's almost like they're creating a hero myth by effectively living out the representation, right? And in doing so, it countervails the representation to the point, so much so that they can perform this overcoding process, right? They can lay atop the new alliance and the direct affiliation over the previous, the previous primitive representation.
All right. Next paragraph. A pause seems in order here while we ask how such a thing is possible. How is it that incest has become possible? Not only possible, the manifest property and seal of the despot. Who is this sister, this mother? The sister and the mother of the despot himself? Or should the question be framed in a different way, for it concerns the whole system of representation when it ceases to be territorial and becomes imperial. First of all, we have the impression that the elements of the in-depth system of representation have begun to move. The cellular migration has begun that will carry the Oedipal self from one locus of representation to another. In the Imperial formation, incest has ceased being the displaced representative of desire to become the repressing representation on itself. Incest has ceased being the displaced representative of desire to becoming the repressed representation itself. For there can be no doubt. This way the despot has of committing incest and of making it possible in no way involves removing the apparatus of social and psychic repression. On the contrary, the despot's intervention forms part of the apparatus. It changes only the parts of the machine, yet it still, as the displaced represented, that incest now comes to occupy the position of the repressing representation. Someone make a mark on that. I need that explained to me. Another gain in the sum of repression, a new economy that is in the repressing apparatus, a new mark, a new severity. It would be easy, too easy, if it were enough to make incest possible, and to implement this in sovereign fashion, so that the exercise of psychic repression and the service of social repression would be made to end. The royal barbarian incest is merely the means to overcload the flows of desire, certainly not a means to liberate them. Gonna have someone read that at some point. O Caligula, O Heliogabalus, O mad memory of vanished emperors. Incest never having been the desire, but merely its displaced represented, as it results from psychic repression. Social repression has everything to gain when incest comes to take the place of the representation itself, and in this capacity take charge of the repressing function. That is what we've already seen in psychosis, where the intrusion of the complex into consciousness, according to the tradition criterion, did not, to be sure, alleviate the repression of desire. With incest's new position in the Imperial formation, we are therefore speaking only of a migration in the in-depth elements of representation, which will render the latter more foreign, more ruthless, more definitive, and more infinite with respect to desiring production. But this migration would never be possible if there did not occur, correlatively, a considerable change in the other elements of representation, those elements that operate on the surface of the inscribing socius. Okay, I have so many questions, but I'm going to let everyone, if anyone has a thought that they want to just jump in, I've got a bunch of questions on this section. I'm taking that as no one has a thought, which is fine. There's a lot happening here. Does someone want to just do me a favor? There's that sentence I asked to put a pin in. The idea of the repressed and displaced repressing representation, that and all of that just feels like word salad when I look at it right now.
Yeah, it's something having to do with incest, or something having to do with how it's represented to desire. I don't know, the only thing that really made sense to me was more in the analytics section, so probably the last chapter, talking about, you must desire actually this, like just the psychoanalysis as an instance of overcoding the unconscious, to just say, everything has to be interpreted as the father and the mother. In this sort of way, making incest possible as something represented, it's kind of like, maybe it's not in this section, but we'll see it later about how the despot sort of has his privileged position as having access to the mother. And it's he occupies the limit that was previously vacant under the previous social formation. Now the despot actually has this level of new alliance to
all right, well,
commit sort of symbolic act.
It may be worth us taking a second to sort of break down, because it's in the Imperial formation, incest has ceased being the displaced represented of desire to becoming the repressing representation itself. So, because before it was the taboo is not actually what is desired. I don't actually, there's no desire to fuck one's sister that doesn't sort of exist in us. But here they're saying it does. Please.
With that example you just gave, I I know there's some line where they say in this book, it's impossible to infer anything about desire, only knowing from what is displaced, what is prohibited to desire. So just because you can't do something doesn't mean that you actually wanted to do that. But I can't. That's only as far as I can take you. If anybody
no, it's fair.
Down the field.
Alyosha, do you have your mic?
What up?
I'd love you to go over what you're chatting about in chat, because I thought, as you did, that the displaced representative precedes repressing representation, but that's not what they're saying here, as far as I can tell. And so now I'm confused.
I mean, I think it still is what they're saying, because they're saying it becomes they specifically say it becomes the repressing representation. So, I mean, that implies that displaced represented is prior, right? That's how I would understand it.
Right. But I mean, in timeline, it is a thing that is prior. It is the displaced represented in the savage times, and as we move into despotic times, it becomes the repressing representation itself. But would that then imply this sentence and what you said then basically say, oh, actually, at this point in time, now it is something that it comes before. It is always with us at this point.
I mean, I'm trying to remember, there was an earlier section where they talked about, this thing about the taboo, and we were saying it now, like that the taboo doesn't represent what is actually desired, but it is a way that it effectively creates that desire for itself as it becomes, I don't know, hegemonic. I don't think that's the language they would use. But to me, that seems to be what it's saying, of like, once it passes into the despotic phase, the simultaneous movement of the prohibition of incest, but then, I guess I'm trying to think of it in the royal context, like you guys were saying, the allowing it with these exceptional cases, it sort of reveals, I guess, to them that it isn't actually, that desire was manufactured because there's a specific purpose it serves at the top of the hierarchy of the coding, I guess.
Okay.
I'm the only way.
I think that's fair. I think that's fair, and the way that they're going about it when they push from the discussion, the sentence I've highlighted, incest has ceased being the displaced representative, becoming the repressing representation itself. They then go directly into talking about another gain in the sum of repression, a new economy in the repressing apparatus, a new mark, a new severity, social repression. And that switch, because at that point, the as soon as we actually do want incest and it becomes a thing that is prohibited socially now, not just repressing representation itself, but it's actually too easy, if it were enough to make incest possible, to implement this in a sovereign fashion, so that the exercise of psychic repression and the service of social repression would be made to end. Incest, royal barbarian incest, is merely mean to overcloud flows of desire. All right, I'll read from the chat. As for Oedipus, is that what you're talking about, Park?
Yeah, it seems like. Yeah.
As for Oedipus in general, it is not the repressed, that is the representative of desire, which is on the side of and completely ignorant of daddy mommy. Nor is it the repressing representation, which is beyond and which renders the persons discernible only by subjecting them to homosexual rules of alliance. Incest is only the retroactive effect of the repressing representation on the repressed representative. The representation disfigures or displaces this representative against which it is directed. It projects onto the representative categories rendered discernible that it has itself established. It applies to the representative terms that did not exist before the alliance organized the positive and the negative into a system and extension. The representation reduces the representative to what is blocked in the system. Oedipus is indeed the limit, but the displaced limit that now passes into the interior of the socius. Oedipus is the baited image with which desire allows itself to be caught. That's what you wanted. The decoded flows were incest. Then a long story begins, the long story of Oedipalization. But to be exact, everything begins in the mind of Laius, the old group homosexual, the pervert who sets a trap for desire. Desire is that, too. Trap. Territorial representation comprises these three instances. the repressive representative, the repressing representation, the displaced representative. So are we going back to, as we were talking about 2 sections ago, the effectively Oedipus being this zombie that can just devour all desire, and as soon as it's able to connect with desire, all it does is basically produce this Oedipal incestuous desire from it, and it's impossible to get away from that hook. That basically we're talking about step 2 in that process here, where we began with incest is it was a thing that was maybe not desired, but it was prohibited because it would break filiation or alliances. One of those 2 things would be destroyed, and we needed to basically survive. So we had those things as prohibitions, less because they were our desires, but more because they're natural. As the despot takes power, the despot comes in and goes, well, actually, now you owe me everything. Therefore, actually, sister, mother, my wife is your queen, which means the mother, and I get to fuck her. I am the extension of everyone's phallus, and my daughter is everyone's sister, and it feels not making the connection.
I think you're on the right track, though. If you go back to the previous section when they talk about the despotic machine, right? One of the things the despotic machine does is it introduces abstracity, right? The abstract, and one of the ways it does this that they elaborate on in this section is through the introduction of writing, right? Writing allows for abstraction, whereas when you're dealing with the more pictographic and the more spoken language, this oral culture that we have in the primitive society, it's not exactly working that way, right? So in terms of semiosis, right, if I remember correctly, the displaced represented is the signified. The repressing representation is the signifier, and in that way, it's the physical marking, right? It's something that can be marked on the body or the object, and in that way, for an oral culture, that's really important because they're not dealing with the written, they're not dealing with the accounting that we're going to see develop in this written society. And so at that level, this is where we talked a little bit about, like, I compared it with double vision, where because the despotic machine is introducing these abstracities and it's over-coding and almost like it's laying bricks over the previous system, the previous territorial representation, but not negating it, but simply creating this kind of polarized tension atop of it. There's this kind of double vision quality to it that leads us to the signified here, which is that abstract quality of the sign.
So Holland, the quote that I'm reading, I've got it open in another window, but Holland's line here: royal incest is still not yet the incest of every man's psychoanalytic Oedipus complex, though we are one step closer. For this form of incest exercises its mode of repression not by universally forbidding it, but by making it licit for the despot alone within a system of rigid caste distinction.
Yeah, it's like a hierarchy that is built. Like the despot, and in this imperial formation, there's some kind of taboo, a law, or some kind of traditional habit that a society has, like the incest prohibition, or any other law or habit in a society that is like a dogma. And by taking this displaced representative of desire and make it a repressing representation, you take the power of it as a despot, and then you create your own law, like in your own sense, and use it for your gain. Like they write, incest never having been the desire, but merely its displaced represented as it results from psychic repression. Social repression has everything to gain when incest comes to take the place of the representation itself, and in this capacity take charge of the repressing function. Like I read it as a form of transformation of power and of the royalty of signifying and creating rules and habits in a society or in a culture.
That's great. Thank you. Actually, I'm starting to connect a little bit more. Any last bits before we move on to the next? I'm trying to make sure we keep a decent pace here to the next paragraph.
Just want to point out that we haven't quite made it to Oedipus here yet either, right? They write, the cellular migration has begun that will carry the Oedipal cell from one locus of representation to another. In the Imperial formation, incest has ceased being the displaced representative desire to become the repressing representation itself. Right, so at that level, we're not actually dealing with Oedipus circulating, but we're seeing how the representation and the kind of structure, I don't want to use the word structure, the way that corresponds to at least the affiliative and alliant, both prohibits and inhibits within itself, and in that very same process, right? It allows for its own sort of triumphing, right? It allows for a despot to sort of seize the power in a sense.
Well, and the last sentence of this, and it's why I wanted to get into the next paragraph. But this migration would never be possible if there did not occur correlatively a considerable change in other elements of representation, those elements that operate on the service of the inscribing socius. The idea of how representation is changing during this time itself, the nature of representation. It's all linked. It's all linked. So I'm gonna dive into the next paragraph. What changes singularly in the surface organization of representation is the relationship between the voice and graphism. It is the despot who establishes the practice of writing. Most ancient authors saw this clearly. It is the imperial formation that makes graphism into a series of writing and into a system of writing in the proper sense of the term. Legislation, bureaucracy, accounting, the collection of taxes, the state monopoly, imperial justice, the functionary's activity, historiography, everything is written in the despot's procession. Let us return to the paradox that emerges from the analyses of Leroy-Gourhan. Primitive societies are oral, not because they lack a graphic system, but because, on the contrary, the graphic system in these societies is independent of the voice. It marks signs on the body that respond to the voice, react to the voice, but that are autonomous and do not align themselves on it. In return, barbarian civilizations are written, not because the voice has been lost, but because the graphic system has lost its independence and its particular dimensions, has aligned itself on the voice, and has become subordinated to the voice, enabling it to extract from the voice a deterritorialized abstract flux that it retains and makes reverberate in that linear code of writing. In short, graphism in one and the same movement begins to depend on the voice, and induces a mute voice from on high or from beyond, a voice that begins to depend on graphism. It is by subordinating itself to the voice that writing supplants it. Anyone want to jump in here? Because they're about to get into Derrida, and I'm not as familiar with Derrida. So
look, Leroy Gourhan, his book is available, and I skimmed it when it was mentioned before. And one of the things that, we're not taking into account, I think, is how much they're taking his view of the primitive and kind of accepting it as the correct view. And he does make this interesting distinction between graphism and voice, and it has to do with also the relationship between the hand and the face and the hand and the mouth as opposite modalities in the development of technology. And so I think, one of the things we'd have to do to get the full picture here is go and read that book by Leroy Gourhan in order to get a full picture of what their idea of what primitive society was like, because it was quite different than I had gotten the picture of just reading this text.
To expand too on like his idea, right? Where so I'll just read the passage and then I'll make my point. In return, barbarian civilizations are written not because the voice has been lost, but because the graphic system has lost its independence and its particular dimensions, has aligned itself on the voice, and has become subordinated to the voice, enabling it to extract from the voice a deterritorialized, abstract flux that it retains and makes reverberate in the linear code of writing. So, right, like this is part of their point that I think is a really big theme in what's happening with the despotic, in the sense that, like, in the primitive, even though you have the lateral alliance and the extended filiation, they have this, what appears to be this sort of like zoning with each other, right, where they're not really crossing. And that's kind of where the incest prohibition seems to come into play in the primitive society, is to prevent this crossing, as opposed to the despot who finds out that who finds a way to do this crossing, and therefore tie the filiative and alliant to themselves, and thereby establish themselves in a seat of power, and establish the first principles of paranoiac knowledge in that. But what I think is interesting here too is, in a similar way, they seem to extend that theme of like these autonomous two dimensions, this autonomous duplexity, getting the lines blurred in the same way with the vocal and with the graphic, right? In terms of not just writing, but effectively, this takes us into a form of recording. This takes us into like how communication is bound up in representation, but also, as part of psychic and social repression.
So when it says the graphism in one and the same movement begins to depend on the voice, what they're talking about there is the alphabet, the development of the alphabet. And Leroy Gorhan had this idea that graphics were two-dimensional and much richer than writing with alphabets. And, he talks about the development of Chinese and Sumerian and Mayan writing as being pictorial. And so he had this idea that graphism was independent of the voice, and that it becomes aligned with the voice, and that was a loss of degrees of freedom for expression when the graphism became aligned with the voice through the alphabet.
I don't think it's just the alphabet. I think it's markings.
So another point that Leroy Gorhan did was he did an analysis of the cave paintings in France, and he had this idea that there was a kind of logic to where those paintings were existed within the cave, and that was kind of like that expression of graphism was much richer than like, for instance, later alphabetical kinds of writing.
And it's worth just bringing up in the chat, they're having a conversation around Bataille's concept of glorious expenditure. Worth reading a bit on, but it does get into that on the next paragraph. And so I want to make sure we don't get too down that road, because they're about to get into a whole lot of other thoughts from a lot of other thinkers. We're going to have a lot of discussion. Yeah. Anyone have last thoughts before we dive into the next paragraph?
Well, one last thing I'd like to make is that Leroy Gorhan was not a regular academic. He was much more versatile than most academics, and he delved into a lot of different areas than most academics would delve into. And he was himself a kind of anomaly in that he tried to create a complete picture of the evolution from the primitive into society with the evolution of human beings. And Pierre Gordon, the strange book that was mentioned before, I think I got that book out and read it. And it is a very strange book. But the point I wanted to make is that these people that he's referring to are themselves anomalies. They're not picking the general consensus authors in these various traditions. They're picking the outliers to base their theory on.
And it's interesting because throughout the book, they've gone back and forth, and it may be. I do wonder, and someone who probably has a better understanding of the timing of all of this would know. They've referenced early on a lot of people who at the time were fringe, but actually over time we've come to accept as more mainstream in their thought process of how they dealt with the history of things. So it's maybe an interesting perspective. All right.
Could I make
please,
one
Jack,
final
go ahead.
Yeah. And I'll even volunteer to read if that makes sense.
Yeah, go for it.
That makes the sale, right?
It does. It helps a lot. Thank you.
Cool. So I just want to real quick highlight those last two sentences with like the grace note, if you will, reading into them. A deterritorialized abstract flux that it retains and makes reverberate in the linear code of writing. This goes back to what I'm calling like the double vision, right? This abstract where we're getting into like the signified here in the despot society and sort of like the more mental side of things, which is intimately tied into the form of writing we're going to see develop. And I think that's important to highlight because when they finish off by saying, in short, graphism in one and the same movement begins to depend on the voice and induces a mute voice from on high or from the beyond, a voice that begins to depend on graphism. It is by subordinating itself to the voice that writing supplants it. So what's part of what's going on is this inversion between the autonomy of writing and the graphic, which, as I'm understanding, is marking in a very broad sense. But in that sense, we're seeing this process of marking, right, of graphism.
Well, okay, so if you look at Leroy Gorhan, what he's talking about is like pictographs, like the pictures that are in the caves in France. That's what and that became, like, for instance, cuneiform. It became hieroglyphs. It became the Chinese characters.
Pictograms.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's why I made the point that, like, I think the graphic is not necessarily the alphabetical. It seems to be. It doesn't seem to just fall in that subset. But I think what's to make my point real quick, I think it's worth noting that the voice begins to depend on graphism, right? Because with writing in that sense, the voices in the society and like even voices of power, right, in terms of the alliant and even the affiliative, are beginning to depend more directly on graphism in that sense, more directly on writing, such that there's an important power relationship where it kind of reminded me of like a master-slave dialectic, but it is by subordinating itself to the voice that writing supplants it, right? Writing seems to be subordinate to the voice, but yet writing supplants the voice, right? Like this reminds me of working in a business where what you say is one thing, but what we record and email on that seems to trump it every time. This is like a very simple legal trick even.
Well, and I think a lot of that, their last thing here, because I think we're having like this discussion around the concept of what they mean by the mute voice here. To me, it's if I have a pictogram on a cave wall of a buffalo being attacked or whatever it may be, or even hieroglyphs, my interpretation of those isn't direct words. It's emotions, thoughts. It's basically how we handle art, versus the moment I start assigning letters to sounds and words end up having direct meaning. As I read them, I'm not saying them aloud. There is that disembodied voice that is reading them to me, that mute voice that does not have sound. That as I'm reading this and I'm reading through, for example, the Discord chat right now, I'm not reading these things aloud. There's no voice doing it. It's a mute voice, even though I'm reading it. That thing that happened suddenly, where once voice in theory was the one that was, the power struggle was very much in favor of the voice, that switched with writing, and suddenly writing became that because it subordinated itself to the voice.
I'd just like to give an example of Namer's palette. Where Namer was the first pharaoh of Egypt in the early dynastic period, and he has this palette where he's conquering other tribes or countries, and so this palette is an example of graphism, of the kind that relates to the despot's power.
I'm going to continue reading. Jacques Derrida is correct in saying that every language presupposes a writing system from which it originates, if by that he means existence and the connection of some sort of graphism, writing in the largest sense of the term. He is also right in saying that, within writing in the narrow sense, hardly any breaks can be established between pictographic, ideogrammic, and phonetic procedures. There is always and already an alignment on the voice, at the same time as a substitution for the voice, supplementarity. And phonetism is never all-powerful, it has also always already begun to labor and elaborate the mute signifier. He is again correct in linking writing to incest in a mysterious fashion, but we see nothing in his link that would lead us to conclude in favor of the constancy of an apparatus of psychic repression, operating in the manner of a graphic machine capable of performing as well by means of hieroglyphs as by phonemes. For there is indeed a break that changes everything in the world of representation, between this writing in the narrow sense and writing in the broad sense. That is, between two completely different orders of inscription. A graphism that leaves the voice dominant by being independent of the voice while connecting with it, and a graphism that dominates or supplants the voice by depending on it in various ways and by subordinating itself to the voice. The primitive territorial sign is self-validating. It is a position of desire in a state of multiple connections. It is not a sign of a sign, nor a desire of a desire. It knows nothing of linear subordination and its reciprocity, neither pictogram nor ideogram. It is rhythm and not form, zigzag and not line, artifact and not idea, production and not expression. Let us try to summarize the differences between these two forms of representation, territorial and imperial. That paragraph is very clear to me. If anyone, it's clear to me, I'm sure everyone else it is too, but I just want to make sure everyone's following what we're talking about.
Since it's directly connected, why don't you go on to the next paragraph?
Yeah, I want to make sure just everyone's cool before I move on, because otherwise this is going to be a lot for us to discuss. Does anyone have an issue so far? Cool. In the first place, territorial representation is made up of two heterogeneous elements, voice and graphism. The former is like the representation of words constituted in lateral alliance, while the latter is like the representation of things, of bodies, established in extended filiation. The former acts on the latter, while the latter reacts on the former, each element having its own particular force that is connoted, along with that of the other, so as to perform the great task of germinal intense repression. What is repressed, in fact, is the full body at the foundation of the intense earth, which must yield its place to the socius in extension, into which the intensities in question pass or fail to pass. The full body of the earth must assume an extension in the socius and as the socius. The primitive socius covers itself in this manner with a network wherein one is continually jumping from words to things and from bodies to appellations, according to the extensive requirements of the system in its length and its width. What we call the order of connotation is an order in which the word, as a vocal sign, designates something, but where the thing designated is no less a sign, because it is furrowed by a graphism that is connoted in conjunction with the voice. The heterogeneity, the divergence, the disequilibrium of the two elements, vocal and graphic, is resolved by a third element, the visual, the eye. It might be said of this eye that it sees the word, it sees it, does not read it, insofar as it evaluates the suffering caused by the graphism. Jean-Francois Lyotard has attempted to describe such a system in another context, where the word has only a designating function, but does not of itself constitute the sign. What becomes a sign is rather the thing or body designated as such, insofar as it reveals an unknown facet described on it, traced by the graphism that responds to the word. The gap between the two elements is bridged by the eye, which sees the word without reading it, inasmuch as it appraises the pain emanating from the graphism applied to the flesh itself. The eye jumps. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So I'd just like to say that Leroy Gorhan has this idea that the vocal and the graphic are two completely different ways of relating to things. And it seems like this bringing in the eye is what's being added here by Deleuze and Guattari. But this is also something that comes from Lacan, because Lacan makes the voice and the eye, the gaze, functions of desire, going beyond Freud. So basically what they're doing here, it seems to me, is they're kind of legitimizing Lacan's emphasis on the eye and the gaze in his work, based on the work of Leroy Gorhan. And this is different from Derrida. So they're differentiating themselves from Derrida, who has a different take on this relationship between speech and writing.
I have one question, since we do have Roger here, if Roger is still listening.
Yes, I am.
I'm wondering about the translation of the word body and bodies in this paragraph, because it feels like I'm missing something to that word, because I don't understand why they're using the term bodies in this section. Because obviously there's lines we can draw and parallels we can draw that are very specific, but why use the term body and bodies here?
I would need to look for it, because I was publishing stuff. So give me a few minutes and I'll come back to you.
No worries, it's worth asking. I'm just trying to figure out, because the representation of things, of bodies, established in extended filiation, what do they mean by bodies there? Does anyone have a way to point me in the right direction? Because they use the term body all the time, and I don't think they're referring to the body without organs here. I don't believe so yet. So it's literally the first run-on large-ass goddamn sentence. Fourth line. Well, the latter is like the representation of things, of bodies, established in extended filiation. Anyone? I mean, literally anyone can jump in. Have a microphone.
So I'll take a crack at it. What I think they're setting up here is they're talking about how territorial representation operates with these two elements in similar relationship to the alliance and filiative. So the voice is compared with the representations of words constituted in lateral alliance, whereas graphism is compared with the representation of things, of bodies, established in extended filiation, right? And when the despot creates the despotic representation in that, or rather the despotic machine creates it, this is what is at stake, right? These are part of the changing parts.
Right.
So I think part of the reason you're using the word...
But this is my issue with the words. The word body here has... English is such a shitty language for this. The word body has a couple of, I would say, pretty diverse ways of using it. The two that come to mind, and the reason I'm having trouble with this is, on the one hand, the human body. It's the thing that I am, the separation of people as individuals. And then the second is body, as in body of work, body of writing, the large grouping of things. And that feels like what they're saying here, but bodies is a decor. So maybe they do mean, well, that's weird.
That's why I think it's helpful to think about in terms of affiliation, right? You're talking
physical
about
bodies.
The vertical hierarchy of how things, even in the sense of like bodies, right, are vertically related. In the same way that I think like bodies and organs have that kind of relationship.
Yeah, I reread it in French, and so the first one is the representation of a word, so it's a representation of a symbol, and the other one would be a representation of body as the material aspect that it refers to. So I think they're making this difference, and then they say something about the corps plein. It's like a full body. I don't know, but like this is from Merleau-Ponty. Maybe Ken could like pitch in on that. It's the full body, and Merleau-Ponty, that doesn't mean just a body that is full. It's clever, more clever than that.
Well, then it's going right over my head.
So it's like the example where they said in a previous section, consider the clock. At one level, when we look at the clock, we were telling time, and there's, of course, a relationship there. But then it also reinforces the territoriality that is on the clock, right, which is that of a 9-to-5 job. So, right, it reinforces, in the example I'm using at least, it reinforces a capitalist workday. It reinforces the territorial representation on the object or body of the clock.
All right, I'm going to continue reading because we do get further on to the three sides, and they talk a little more about the body. Thank you for that, Roger. It just felt the English language is confusing to read these things, so it's tough.
Yeah, but even the translation, sometimes it becomes difficult because of certain styles. And even in French, you need to reread it like a few times. So,
I would go with the idea that body here is intended to mean something slightly more clever than just body. That it's
no, but that's the thing. That's the problem that a lot of people have with Deleuze and Guattari. It's like they tend to make stuff so complicated, but it's not. Compared to like the other French authors, they are way more simple. When they mean something, when they say something, they mean that thing. It's not like multi-level of understanding.
Well, no, but the translation, the difficulty for me when they use the term here, the first time I read it, and I think I'm starting to grasp it more, is it was representation of bodies, humans and people inside of, and that's not right. Whereas I think Jared puts it nicely, it's assemblages material bodies of things.
Yes.
And I like that. That makes a lot more sense to me. Again, the difficulty of trying to grasp what they're trying to say. So I think it's slightly more clever than I put it normally, but not quite as clever as some people go. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Goddamn.
But yeah, it's
these fucking guys.
Because I don't have the English version today. I'm not following the English version. I'm just into the French one. But do they say it's la représentation de choses, parenthesis, de corps. So do they say the representation of things, parenthesis, of body?
They don't use bodies. They use hyphens, which again different.
No, but that is what they say.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's the direct translation. So
it's a very direct translation.
Yeah. I think one of the first things you brought up when you saw the words bodies was you're like, okay, so these aren't BWOs. So I think we don't need to get so confused as to think that every body has to be a BWO. But for instance, I think when they're saying bodies here, they're meaning like they can be relatively coded or uncoded. And the BWO is like the limit of being totally destratified, totally not organized at all. But here in the third chapter, we're thinking about social processes. Yeah, someone says territorialized by the territorial machine, definitely. But once it's in the imperial representation, which is the section we're reading now, the body itself becomes more overcoded and more like one thing Lacan himself would talk about is endogenous or erogenous zones, whatever, I can't pronounce it, but how the body gets coded from infancy into adulthood as certain zones becomes erogenous zones instead of the whole body. So instead, this same process can happen to the body of the earth, or even like the whole body, every organ gets assigned to sort of role within the social structure, whether it's an imperial one or it's a primitive inscriptive one.
I guess, but for this passage, it's a way too complicated thought, because as I read this first sentence of the paragraph, this with in the first place, blah, 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 territorial representation is made up of two heterogeneous elements, voice and graphism. Then they try to differentiate these, and voice is constituted by the lateral alliance. These are the representation of words, like words are created in the lateral alliances, like in the communication with other people, and the latter graphisms, like inscriptions, every kind of symbol, start as a representation of things, of bodies, like in the world, like a cow that gets sketched on a wall and then slowly over generations get transformed into different letters. And these both systems of voice and graphism interact with each other, like in this intense repression they are talking about.
Definitely. When something that you're going to want to keep in mind is when D&G talk about representation in this way, it is a repressive function. So the representation of things / bodies or hyphen bodies, as it's written in this sentence, it's like these things are becoming subordinated to their representation, their social representation as it's inscribed on the socius. But anyways, this comes. What they're saying is that this comes from a writing system rather than an oral or spoken tradition, which is more open, which is more capable of being adapted and going both ways, versus an overcoded imperial system of writing, which is going to be structured around hard binaries that are exclusive, mutually exclusive, and this.
Yeah, and that is not interactive, but linear in a sense.
I actually, because, the thing I'm going to let you finish, but I really like that specific thing you just said, that Triad, that they call it linear. That actually really hits me in a really nice way, because it's that there is a nature to that. What you're talking about, the dynamism of a purely vocal voice versus graphism, which becomes etched in stone, for lack of a better term, but also has a very linear nature to how it moves forward, rather than the dynamism of a story passed down. I really like how you put that. Thank you.
Yeah, because these are maybe proto-syntactic systems, maybe not in a way of symbols like paintings on a cave wall, but later alphabets and stuff like that, or bureaucratic processes. These are all syntactical in a sense, that they have distinct elements that you have to read in a linear order, like an algorithm.
So one thing we ought to mention is what Derrida says, which is that that in our tradition there is this bias, which he calls logocentrism, toward the voice, and this repression of writing. And so grammatology is about that. And Derrida based that on a work which had been done just before that, which was a kind of discussion of writing in general across the earth. And but even though the first writing was like hieroglyphs or cuneiform, Derrida doesn't really go into the as far as I remember, the difference between that and alphabetical writing so much. But here, what they're focusing on is the difference between the earlier writing systems that were non-alphabetical and the later alphabetical writing systems. And there's a big difference between those.
Well, it's actually maybe worth reading the footnote before we move on. Lyotard reestablishes the overly neglected rights of a theory of pure designation. He shows the irreducible gap between the word and the thing in the relationship of designation that connotes them. By virtue of this gap, it is the thing designated that becomes the sign by revealing an unknown facet as a hidden content. Words are not themselves signs. They transform into signs the things or bodies they designate. At the same time, it is the designating word that becomes visible, independently of any writing reading, by revealing a strange ability to be seen, not read. See Lyotard, Discourse Figure, reference 85. Words are not things, but as soon as there is a word, the object designated becomes a sign, which means precisely that it conceals a hidden content within its manifest identity, that it reserves another face for another view focused on it, which perhaps will never be seen, but which in return will be viewed in the word itself.
I want to make one quick point before we move
Go for it.
Into the next paragraph too, though. Is I think it's important to flesh out a little bit further that this analogy they're making with, or rather this relationship between the aligned and affiliative, because as these objects are tied up with affiliative, right, we're talking about how objects and bodies build up vertically, but in that same regard, I think there's also a sense of like, whose stuff it is, right, and where it fits in society, where it fits in terms of the economic and the power, also in a horizontal sense. And in that way, right, as we're moving into the society where the abstraction is coming into being in that, I think this is going to get more and more important, because what a system of accounting, a system of law, all in this particular use of writing, as they say in the formal sense of writing, does is it ties this stuff to a certain way, not only back to the despot and their center of power, but it does so by connecting it in a certain vertical and horizontal way. And I think that's why it's really critical that they're using Lyotard here so explicitly to talk about designation and the I here, because in the primitive society, the I extracts the surplus code from the veritable theater of cruelty. But here they're also making the point that there is this vocal sign and there is this graphic sign, right? And the I is designating, the I as the intermediary is designating these signs, right? And in that way, the I has a tremendous use of power here, because it is effectively designating signs, calling them out, finding them, so to speak. And I think that's going to be really critical as we're watching this representation go through this genealogy.
Well, that's a really nice way to dovetail. I'm going to start reading now, because that's immediately what the next paragraph is about. The magic triangle with its three sides, voice audition, graphism, body, eye pain, thus seems to us to be an order of connotation, a system of cruelty where the word has essentially designated function, but where the graphism itself constitutes sign in conjunction with the thing designated, and where the eye goes from one to the other, extracting and measuring the visibility of the one against the pain of the other. Everything in the system is active, enacted, or reacting. Everything is a matter of use and function, so that when one considers the whole of territorial representation, one is struck by the complexity of the networks with which it covers the socius. The chain of territorial signs is continually jumping from one element to another, radiating in all directions, emitting detachments wherever there are flows to be selected, including disjunctions, consuming remains, extracting surplus values, connecting words, bodies, sufferings, and formulas, things, and affects, connoting voices, graphic traces, and eyes, always in polyvocal usage, a way of jumping that cannot be contained within an order of meaning, still less within a signifier. And if incest seemed impossible to us from this point of view, it is because incest is nothing other than a jump that necessarily fails. This jump that goes from appellations to persons, to bodies. On the one hand, the repressed this side of appellations that do not yet designate persons but only intensive germinal states. On the other hand, the repressing beyond that only applies appellations to persons by prohibiting persons answer to the names of sister, mother, father. Between the two, the shallow stream where nothing passes, or the appellations do not adhere to the persons elude the graphic action, where the eye no longer has anything to see or evaluate. Incest, the simple displaced limit, neither repressed nor repressing, but merely the displaced representative of desire. From this moment on, it appears indeed the two dimensions of representation, its surface organization, elements voice graphii. Again, voice graphii, and its in-depth organization, the represented instances of desire repressing, representation, displaced representative, share the same fate, like a system of correspondences in the heart of a given social machine. Anyone?
Just sounds that if we dismiss language, we're gonna have a lot of fun.
Feels like, yeah, especially the written word. Like, for sure, we need to get rid of the written word and direct signs. Written word sucks. So, chat, what are you saying today? I know there's no getting rid of the written word. I'm reading your chat right now. I wish I could. Okay, let's take a step by step. First, I'd love if anyone wants to jump in on one sentence that struck me that's interesting, so that when one considers the whole of territorial representation, one is struck by the complexity of the networks with which it covers the socius. And it goes through all of the different setups. And then the line, a way of jumping, a polyvocal usage, a way of jumping that cannot be contained within an order of meaning. Can anyone give me an example? What that means? Anyone?
I kind of took it in terms of like, so I could be wrong here, but it reminded me of Saussure in the sense that like the sign doesn't take you to the referent.
I see it as this reference to structuralism, that these signs don't have their meaning in them, not even in their signifier, that when you look at the strict signifier or what it means in a specific situation, you don't grasp this whole system, this chain of territorial signs that is continually jumping, like these are heterogenic. Because it's this territorial representative system of so many different chains that have different codes, they're using connecting words, voices, graphic traces, maybe even processes in bureaucracy. All this stuff is connected in different networks and structures that build a kind of meta structure that is this whole system of representations that you can't reduce to a single meaning or to the signifiers themselves.
And so that's applicable to incest in the sense that incest itself is this kind of jump that doesn't work because we have a lot of assumptions made around the signifier, even though the signifier itself may have little to no bearing on reality.
The passage might really be elucidating here. And if incest seemed impossible to us from this point of view, it is because incest is nothing other than a jump that necessarily fails. This jump goes from appellations to persons, from names to bodies. On the other hand, the repressed this side of appellations that do not yet designate persons, but only intensive germinal states. On the other hand, the repressing beyond that only applies appellations to persons by prohibiting persons who answer to the names of sister, mother, father. So, like, to put it in a nutshell, right, there's a way that categorization, especially in terms of the aligned and filiative, is that representation is placed upon the socius, and that corresponds to people, right? There's namings of them and there's categorizings of them. And that categorization, that representation is effectively where the prohibition is coming into being, right? It's circulating at this marking of bodies. So if your body is marked as a mother, there is a prohibition in terms of how a mother can circulate, of how a mother fits into the filiative and the alliant.
Yeah, because mother, sister, and father have only a meaning in this specific structure, in the specific change of representation. Without these strict systems or change of signifiers, words like incest or taboos like these wouldn't have any meaning. They don't have an essence of meaning to them, but only in relation in the structure to other signifiers or markings.
Yeah, the body is territorialized, and that's where I see the failed jumping. Is you're jumping from the body to a name, you're jumping from a body to a category, and that's the failed jump. Right,
from a thing
jumping from a sign to the referent seems to fail.
From a thing to its signifier.
Yes. Well, the sign.
To its sign. And to mention it is saucer, I believe. Alyosha was giving you shit about pronunciation, and do not feel bad. I just want to give Alyosha a little bit of shit because I didn't hear Foucault pronounced aloud until I was 23. So until then, I was calling him Foucault. That's just the way it worked. And I did that for years and thought I was quite clever. So it's just the way it goes. Saucer.
It's saussure.
Yeah, that's the French way of saying it.
Ferdinand de Saussure.
Exactly.
You have to say it like you ate an oyster and it disagreed with you.
So his first name, it ends with a D, because in English you would say Ferdinand, but it's in French you don't say the D, so it's Ferdinand.
What a language.
This thing about jumping, I'm reminded of Lacan defining desire in terms of montage. And so in montage, you have the jumping from one image to another within the film. And so I think that one of the things they might have in mind is that kind of jump from image to image.
Actually, that's probably what they are talking about, because they're contemporarily calling out some things from Lacan throughout this chapter, and that would make sense that they'd continue. I mean, it's still accurate to what everyone's saying here. So it's like it's an interesting sort of poetic twist on what they're talking about. I like it.
So this gets refined in the cinema series because in there he talks about the movement image and the time image, and talks about Persian semiotics with respect to the movement image. So so anyway, that's what this reminds.
All right. I'm going to push ahead. This is a long paragraph, so please, if you have stuff to say, make notes. We will at some point try to stop. All this finds itself overwhelmed in a new destiny, with the despotic machine and imperial representation. In the first place, graphism aligns itself on the voice, falls back on the voice, and becomes writing. The term falls back on. At the same time, it induces the voice no longer as the voice of alliance, but as that of the new alliance, a fictitious voice from beyond that expresses itself in the flow of writing as direct filiation. These two fundamental despotic categories are also the movement of graphism that, at one and the same time, subordinates itself to the voice in order to subordinate the voice and supplant it. Then there occurs a crushing of the magic triangle. The voice no longer sings, but dictates, decrees. The graphy no longer dances, it ceases to animate bodies, but is set into writing on tablets, stones, and books. The eye sets itself to reading. Writing does not entail, but implies a kind of blindness, loss of vision, and the ability to appraise. It is now the eye that suffers, although it also acquires other functions. Or rather, we are unable to say that the magic triangle is completely crushed. It subsists as a base and as a brick, insofar as the territorial machine continues to function in the framework of the new machine. The triangle has become the base for a pyramid, all of whose sides cause the vocal, the graphic, and the visual to converge toward an imminent unity of the despot. If we call the order of representation in a social system a plane of consistency, on the consistance, it is evident that this plane has changed, that it has become a plane of subordination and no longer one of connotation. And here, in this second place, is the essential. The flattening of the graphy onto the voice has made a transcendent object jump outside the chain, a mute voice on which the whole chain now seems to depend, and in relation to which it becomes linearized. The subordination of graphism to the voice induces a fictitious voice from on high, which, inversely, no longer expresses itself except through the writing signs that it emits, revelation. This is perhaps the first assembling of formal operations that will lead to Oedipus, paralogism of extrapolation, a flattening out or a set of biunivocal relations that leads to the breakaway and elevation of a detached object and linearization of a chain that derives from this object. Feels like what we were just talking about expanded out. I think we did a good job in analyzing the last paragraph, everyone. What it feels like to me. Anyone?
Yeah, sounds like it.
It feels like we got a bunch right. That's what it, and then they just went through a handful of things. Roger, go ahead.
And then the following sentence, they say, "But what does it mean?"
Yeah, no, we're about to throw everything out of the window. I know, but I'm just excited because we actually very much were going through the concept of how these things work together and what the intention was, and it was nice. I'm just going to read Alyosha's comment. This revelation example is a strange one, especially as they use Islam afterwards, whose revelatory text is couched entirely in first-person statements or commands directly from God, which I think is the point of what they're talking about here, actually, despotic, that those words become the words of God because they are written instead of handed down, where it can take on a secondary meaning and have a little bit more story to it, because at that point it's polyvocity versus univocity of God giving us the words that's written.
That's a tough one, and I think we'll have to piece through that maybe another time, because the Quran was not written obviously originally. I'm just trying to understand it in that framework, because they're saying it no longer expresses itself, this mute voice, except through the writing signs that it emits, i.e. revelation, which I can kind of, in principle, that kind of makes sense, that idea. But then I'm thinking about how explicit Quranic revelation is about itself. And it even does talk about itself as a form of writing. So maybe it does. But I'm just trying to understand it, because afterwards they actually use it directly.
They literally do that in this next paragraph. So I'm going to charge ahead because they're about to say, what does it It is perhaps at this juncture that the question, what does it mean, begins to be heard. There. And that problems of I never can pronounce this fucking word. Anyone?
Exegesis.
Exegesis, thank you. Prevail over other problems of use and efficacy. The emperor, the god, what did he mean? In place of segments of the chain that are always detachable, attached partial object on which the whole chain depends. In place of a polyvocal graphism flush with the real, a biunivocalization forming the transcendent dimension that gives rise to a linearity. In place of non-signifying signs that compose the networks of a territorial chain, despotic signifier from which all the signs uniformly flow in a deterritorialized flow of writing. Men have even been seen drinking this flow. Andres Zemplini shows how, in certain regions of Senegal, Islam superimposes a plane of subordination on the old plane of connotation of animist values. The divine or prophetic word, written or recited, is the foundation of this universe. The transparence of the animist prayer yields to the opacity of the rigid Arab verse. Speech rigidities into formulas whose power is ensured by the truth of the revelation and not by a symbolic or incantory efficacy. The Muslim holy man's learning refers to a hierarchy of names, verses, numbers, and corresponding beings, and if necessary, the verse will be placed in a bottle filled with pure water. The verse water will be drunk, one's body will be rubbed with it, and one's hands will be washed with it. Writing, the first deterritorialized flow, drinkable on this account. It flows from the despotic signifier. For what is the signifier in the first instance? What is it in relation to the non-signifying territorial signs? Jumps outside their chains and superimposes a plane of subordination on their plane of immanent connotation. The signifier is the sign that has become a sign of the sign. Despotic sign having replaced territorial sign, having crossed the threshold of deterritorialization. The signifier is merely the deterritorialized sign itself. Sign made letter. Desire no longer dares to desire, having become a desire of desire, a desire of the despot's desire. The mouth no longer speaks, it drinks the letter. The eye no longer sees, it reads. The body no longer allows itself to be engraved like the earth, but prostrates itself before the engravings of the despot, the region beyond the earth, the new full body. Please, Alyosha, please comment on, because I do think their use of the Quran here is fascinating, as well as their sort of reference of some of the older and still modern rituals. But it's all of this also ties back. It would seem I'm surprised they didn't mention how you can't have the old graphs of Muhammad drawn. And actually, there's a lot of things you're not allowed to draw inside of the Muslim religion because they don't want them.
I'm not sure if there's a specific. Sorry, I just have the doorbell here. I'm not sure if I can. I'm still trying to piece through it in my head. I mean, I'm always suspicious of like these kinds of phrases, the opacity of the rigid Arab verse, like these kinds of things. I get what they're trying to say. I almost wonder sometimes if they like are writing like this is kind of retroactively applying Christian tropes to other religious experiences, which are just different. I think I might need to think about that and evolve that thought, because I would actually look at like the period of revelation, the early period of Muhammad's revelation, as much more along the lines of the kind of polyvocal, disruptive, schizo speech that they tend to talk about. So, but I mean, there's no denying in terms of like, the way it's established as a major religion over the world, all that good stuff. I'm reading this section, and because it's a point of reference, I think I'm a bit closer to. I'm trying to piece through it, because I don't know if I get the idea of despotic signifier, but I think they are trying to take that surface level easiness, because one of the things that is true is that these things are words from himself. Like this, take the Christian Bible, take really any other writings. They're all explicitly not the word of God. Even though they're talked about as being the word of God, they are the word of God is spoken to someone else and then reinterpreted. They actually go through that a lot. Whereas the Quran is very much from first person. Right.
And I think that that specificity is the example, the reason they're using it. And I don't know if there's much more depth. I'm going to assume there's actually not a lot more depth to what they're saying. And they're talking about it purely as Muhammad came in. These are the words, and they're such the words that as they use the example, the verse placed inside of water and water drank. So that way the verse can, help the person. And these old timey rituals, which I know there's all kinds of stories, but more that as being a fable, as an interesting way of having these words themselves be literal words of God, and how much they've taken over the thing they were signifying.
Yeah, I think I'm not smart enough for this section yet. I'll have some thinking.
I'll give you like a real world example. I used to have a roommate when I was working into another town, and he was from Senegal. And we had those talks at length about religion and the tripartition of religion in Senegal, and they refer to animism. And then he was telling me that there was the Christian religion, but also there was the Muslim religion, and everything was intertwined, like culturally. So like they would believe in God, but also they would believe that the rock, would be like an entity that can interact in their life. So if we take it like this, and we put it into ontological terms. For example, animism is a form of ontology. And then the written word of the Muslim is from another ontology, which is more transcendental. That's something that is immanent. So what they're referring to here is how there's a coupling, how there's like a multiplicity within those, the encounter of those ontology that produces a new arrangement of signifier, of signs, but also of senses. So, and what they're saying is that the written word with formulas and everything into that kind of specific ontology that have at its core a form of transcendence will actually put itself in the background of any animist practices. So basically, they're going to be there both at the same time, but the colonized ontology will be subordinated to the first. I don't know if you follow all of this.
It's really helpful. I think there's a truth in that, in terms of if you look at also how did any major sort of like imperial religious system adapt itself to so many different contexts, which Christianity also did previously with the example of virgin.
But what I would say something even worse. It doesn't adapt the concept. It doesn't adapt itself to the context, but it adapts the context to itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. The famous example of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and in Mexico, and the fusion. Yeah, like you say, it's not even just the fusion of an existing situation, but sort of creating a new situation where these new forms of ancient gods can be reinterpreted in light of this master god, which is now the Christian god, and stuff like that. That stuff makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting they use Senegal as the example, and that may be what also helps Alyosha if you want to do readings on how Senegal switched from being a deeply animistic culture to in come the French, and it's basically colonized. And so there's kind of like four sects. There's the Christians who are still they still have animism as kind of part. They've brought it in. The same with the Muslim side. Then there's those who are just still very much sort of the traditional, and then the secular, which is because the government's deeply secular, and it's actually something all the groups agree on, is that they need to be secular. So it's a really interesting country. I mean, awful history, but really interesting country in terms of how the despotic and Imperial takes over. Probably the reason they picked that.
Also Francophone, so might be close.
It is. The French are the ones who came in and took it over. They're the Imperial bastard time around. No offense, Roger.
Hmm? I'm not French.
Yeah.
We are rejects from France.
Oh, yeah. I guess I'll continue.
Well, before you do,
Brooks, if you want.
Oh, go for it. But Roger had a thing real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
Oh, no, me no.
No, someone did.
that
Jack.
was me. Yes, because Alibaba has come today. No, in all seriousness, I do think it's worth expanding too, though. Roger's absolutely right. There's an ontological point here in terms of like how the representation is fleshing out over the socius and is fleshing out to effectively create a kind of reality, right? Well, I got to be careful there because that's a little bit more complicated than that. Socius and fleshing out in that sense. When they ask the question, what does it mean? Right, and they use the word exegesis here, right, which is like scriptural interpretation or like critical interpretation. But right, they're talking about understanding things and interpreting them, right, which I think is really important in terms of the signification, but also with the eye, and how things are being, how things are going from being marked to dealing with this abstraction, right? Because they're using the example of somebody who's writing on Islam, but it's not simply Islam they're talking about here, right? It's this way that's, without going too deeply into it, it's this way that what is written, right, ties back to the despot. And in that sense, the despot becomes the full body of things, right? So we're moving from connotation to into the system. And I think just what I want to point out here is that with connotation, we're talking about things connoting the earthly, right? At least in the primitive society, there's at least the earth is socius there. Whereas now we're tying things back to the despotic, or not the despot, to the despot themselves, which is how writing serves here. This example of Islam, I think, is meant to demonstrate how writing both represents, I shouldn't even say represents, how writing addresses bodies in that, and how we look to things like laws at this level of their sort of power relation within the representation.
Shall I do the next paragraph?
Please dive in.
Okay, no water will ever cleanse the signifier of its imperial origin, the signifying master or the master signifier. In vain will the signifier be immersed in the immanent system of language, la langue, or be used to clear away problems of meaning and signification, or be resolved into the coexistence of phonematic elements, where the signified is no more than the summary of the respective differential values of these elements in the relationships among themselves. In vain will the comparison of language, see langage, I'm not saying how you say that, to exchange and money be pushed to its furthest point, subjecting language to the paradigms of an active capitalism. One will never prevent the signifier from reintroducing its transcendence, from bearing witness for a vanished despot who still functions in modern imperialism. Even when it speaks Swiss or American, linguistics manipulates the shadow of Oriental despotism. Oof. Ferdinand de Saussure does not merely emphasize the following, that the arbitrariness of language establishes its sovereignty as a servitude or a generalized slavery visited upon the masses, quote-unquote masses. It has also been shown that two dimensions exist side by side in Saussure. One horizontal, where the signified is reduced to the value of coexisting minimal terms into which the signifier decomposes, but the other vertical, where the signifier is elevated to the concept corresponding to the acoustic image, that is, to the voice, taken in its maximum extension, which recomposes the signifier value as the opposite of the coexisting terms, but also the concept as the opposite of the acoustic image. In short, the signifier appears twice, once in the chain of elements in relation to which the signified is always a signifier for another signifier, and a second time in the detached object on which the whole of the chain depends, and that spreads over the chain, the effects of signification. There is no phonological or even phonetic code operating on the signifier in the first sense, without an overcoding affected by the signifier itself in the second sense. All right, then.
Okay.
I'm joking in the chat. I was saying I couldn't understand less a body of text being read out loud unless it was Finnegan's Wake.
It's up there. This is significant. And there's just a lot that we could dive into and go into. And I'm actually going to suggest at this point we finish analyzing this paragraph, and then we do what we can to continue tomorrow rather than do a review session. So do what we can do about just reading through. We'll do another one of these tomorrow. But for this paragraph specifically, where do we want to start? Because there's layers to this that are worth, I don't know, tearing apart and figuring out.
I'd like to recommend that we read the next paragraph, because it seems to me like they're making their main point in the paragraph.
Okay, I'm down with that.
And in the French version, it's no separate paragraph. It's one continuous block of text.
It is a continuous block of text in one of my texts as well. So it's a second sense is where it ends in this one. But I'm going to continue reading on, and we'll see what we can do. There is no linguistic field without biunivocal relations. That's where we left off, correct?
Yes.
Whether between ideographic and phonetic values or between articulations of different levels, monemes and phonemes, that finally ensure the independence and the linearity of the deterritorialized signs. But such a field remains defined by a transcendence, even when one considers this transcendence as an absence or an empty locus, performing the necessary foldings, levelings, and subordinations. A transcendence, whence issues throughout the system the inarticulate material flux in which this transcendence operates. 1 second, I just had a stroke. Okay. I'm going to reread that sentence. But such a field remains defined by a transcendence, even when one considers this transcendence as an absence or an empty locus, performing the necessary foldings, levelings, and subordinations. A transcendence whence issues throughout the system the inarticulate material flux in which this transcendence operates, opposes, selects, and combines. The signifier. It is curious, therefore, that one can show so well the servitude of the masses with respect to the minimal elements of the sign within the immanence of language, without showing how the domination is exercised through and in the transcendence of the signifier. There, however, as elsewhere, an irreducible exteriority of conquest asserts itself. For if language itself does not presuppose conquest, the leveling operations that constitute written language indeed presuppose two inscriptions do not speak the same language. Two languages, one of masters and the other of slaves. This person describes such a situation. For the Sumerians, a given sign is water. Sumerians read this sign A, which signifies water in Sumerian. An Akkadian comes along and asks his Sumerian master, "What is this sign?" Sumerian replies, "A." The Akkadian takes this sign for A, and on this point there is no longer any relationship between the sign and water, which in Akkadian is called mu. I believe that the presence of the Akkadians determined the phoneticization of the writing system, and that the contact of two peoples is almost necessary before the spark of new writing can spring forth. Whew.
Yeah, I just like to note that, we in the Lacan reading group, we were just reading a section, and I was surprised to see that Lacan uses this term biunivocal. So it's not something that was made up by Deleuze.
No, it's generally a lot of people in the tradition of psychoanalysis speak to it because it's a question of The voices with which we talk with, there's the voice that you're literally hearing right now, and then there's my actual voice that's sort of internal monologue, and that they do a lot of discussions around that, and Lacan references those kinds of things pretty commonly when it comes to how signifier sort of plays around. So really, this whole paragraph is a nightmare to me. It's have you ever been driving like on a road trip so long that eventually you stop realizing that you're moving and it feels like the white line is just coming at you? That's how reading this felt. I just kind of just ended up on autopilot. And
I think that this part in this paragraph, the second paragraph that you read, is kind of like the key point that they're trying to get across, which is about transcendence. So basically it says, but such a field remains defined by a transcendence even when one considers this transcendence as the absence or the empty locus, performing the necessary foldings, levelings, and subordinations. A transcendence whence issues throughout the system an inarticulate material flux in which this transcendence operates, opposes, selects, and combines the signifier. So basically, if we ever get around to reading difference and repetition, in difference and repetition, they're talking about a transcendent which is immanent, which is the limit of the immanent realm which it's in. And one of the things that Deleuze says is that if you take those transcendences within the immanent realm to their limit, it becomes something different than you would have expected. And I think that's kind of the function they're talking about here, is this immanent transcendent which differentiates itself when pushed to its limit.
Mm-hmm. So, and then we can say it in like really dumb terms. Reality is unorganized, and then the transcendent discourse will organize it in one way. It's only when it is encountering another form of understanding that, does not relate to the transcendent form that could give rise to a new combination. Only thing, it's like two different ways of understanding the world coming together will spark a third manner of understanding.
I have to wonder also if there's and I'm sure I'm jumping a million miles ahead, but a lot of what they're talking about with the Akkadians and Sumerians, I have to wonder if there's a thing that happens with the fact that English is basically what is commonly accepted as the way we do business and how capital functions now, how much that affects on everything.
So being from another culture, being French, for example, we have a...
See, you're French.
Yeah, okay.
I gotcha.
So our language is a little bit more poetic, and there's a lot of like double, triple senses to what we say. But when we come to English, and that's something that I've done with a lot of French philosophy, it's really easier to understand in English because there's a pragmatic sense to English that we don't really have in French. So the transcendent logic of English is a pragmatic economic. There's an economy of words and there's an economy of sense, which you don't have in some other languages. I'm just taking French as one example, but this is how the colonization, of a culture, of a country by English forces, would transform, even through language, people into producers and agents of capitalism. Even if they were colonized and being exploited, they were still becoming more and more agents of capitalism because they would understand the world through the English logic that was underlying that language.
Yeah, and it's.
I want to emphasize something that Roger said, which is, Gregory Bateson wrote this amazing book called Mind and Nature. And basically what he says in there is that it's kind of a question that he raises, is that why is it that when you study two things completely independent of each other, two different subjects, that you get a better quality of information than if you just studied each one separately alone. And so I think that's the thing about the two languages is kind of like talking about that this phenomena that when two languages interact, you get something that goes beyond what any one of those languages might have on its own. And it's very interesting that Assyrian, Sumerian and Akkadian was like that. And more recent research suggests that the Akkadian was there from the beginning. And it wasn't that the Akkadians took over Sumeria, but that the Akkadians were there from the beginning, and that the Sumerian written language was more a language of scholarly classes that was based on accounting from the beginning, and then accounting for things was the basis of Sumerian writing in cuneiform, and then other functions were added on once they realized what writing could do. But so anyway, there's this really interesting relationship between the Sumerian writing and by the way, Sumerian is a unique language doesn't seem to be related to any other language group, and so that's always a big question of the anomaly of the Sumerian language. But Akkadian is a Semitic language.
And I think with that, I'm going to put a pin in this. We are going to continue tomorrow. I will see you guys back here. We will do another live stream. This has been fun. Thank you all for your contributions, and I hope most of you can join us, because this is a really wonderful text, and we're starting to get somewhere, or we're starting to talk about some very important and concrete things, which is nice. Speaking of language, thank all of you guys, and we'll continue another time.
Thank you for that.